Heartless judge kicks black pregnant lady, unaware who she is. Leah's heart pounded as she clutched her swollen belly, standing alone in the middle of the packed courtroom. All eyes were on her, but the judge's cold stare bore into her with an intensity that made her knees wobble. 8 months pregnant and visibly exhausted, she had come here seeking justice. Instead, she was met with whispers, smirks, and the oppressive weight of a system designed to silence her. "Order in the court," Judge Morgan roared, his gavel slamming down like a hammer sealing her fate. He was a towering man with a stern face, his reputation for harshness amplified when his gavel targeted people like Leah. Rumors had swirled about his bias, but she had hoped, prayed, that her truth would matter more than his prejudice. "You again?" the judge sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Another waste of this court's time." His words cut through the air like a blade, and a ripple of laughter spread among a few spectators. Leah's face burned, but she stood firm, her hands protectively cradling her unborn child. Little did Judge Morgan know that Leah wasn't just another case. She was a fighter, and the secret she carried would shake his courtroom to its very foundations. Leah's life hadn't always been filled with such turmoil. Born and raised in a small, tight-knit community, she had grown up surrounded by love and hope. Her mother, a schoolteacher, and her father, a local activist, had instilled in her a sense of justice and the courage to stand up for what was right. As the eldest of 3 siblings, she often found herself stepping into a protective role, a trait that had carried over into her adult life. But life had taken an unexpected turn for Leah. Her struggles began a few months ago when she was walking home from her job at a local community center. It had been a typical evening until a police car, speeding through the narrow streets, slammed to a halt just inches from where she stood. The officer, an imposing man named Officer Richards, stepped out, his face twisted with annoyance. "What are you doing in the middle of the street?" he barked. Leah had been on the sidewalk, but her protest fell on deaf ears. Without listening, Richards issued her a citation, claiming she had obstructed traffic. She had tried to argue, but his sneer and dismissive attitude made it clear that this was not about the law, it was personal. It wasn't just the ticket, it was the humiliation, the way he looked at her as though she were beneath him. The unfair ticket would have been a small inconvenience if it weren't for what happened next. Leah decided to contest it in court, believing that the justice system would see the truth. However, her experience in the courtroom proved otherwise. Judge Morgan dismissed her concerns without even hearing her out, citing a lack of evidence. His words echoed in her mind. "Your word against an officer's? Case dismissed." The cold indifference in his voice crushed her hope. That day, Leah realized this wasn't just about a traffic ticket. It was about something bigger. It was about the systemic discrimination that people like her faced every day. She could feel the weight of generations pressing down on her shoulders, and she knew she had to do something. With her baby on the way, she couldn't let this injustice go unchallenged. She wanted her child to grow up in a world where they wouldn't have to fight so hard just to be heard. Her resolve only strengthened after she shared her story with her best friend, Olivia. Olivia, a fiery advocate for social justice, was outraged. Together, they began collecting stories from others who had suffered under the biases of Judge Morgan and officers like Richards. The more they dug, the clearer it became that Leah's experience wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. Through long nights of researching and organizing, Leah and Olivia uncovered a troubling history tied to Judge Morgan. Complaints of unfair treatment, biased rulings, and dismissive behavior toward minorities painted a damning picture. Leah's father, a respected figure in the community, urged her to be cautious but promised his full support. "You're fighting for all of us," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But you're also fighting for your future, for your child's future." The stakes grew higher when Olivia managed to contact a local journalist who was eager to expose the injustices happening in their community. The journalist's involvement added a layer of protection and visibility to Leah's fight, but it also put her in the crosshairs of those who wanted to maintain the status quo. Now, as she stood in that courtroom, the weight of her journey bore down on her. Leah knew that she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was standing up for every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or belittled. Her baby's faint kicks reminded her of what was at stake, a better, fairer world for the next generation. This wasn't just a battle against a single judge. It was a stand against an entire system that had failed too many for too long. As the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence, Leah glanced over at Olivia, who gave her a reassuring nod from the gallery. Despite her nerves, Leah knew she had no choice but to push forward. She had come too far to let fear silence her now. "Miss Carter," Judge Morgan's cold voice echoed through the room, "you have 5 minutes to explain why this court should reconsider your case. If you waste my time, you'll regret it." Leah's fingers gripped the edge of the defendant's table. She took a deep breath, willing her voice not to waver. "Your Honor, I'm here because I believe in the justice system. I came to this courtroom seeking fairness, but instead, I was dismissed without being heard. That's not justice. That's prejudice." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Judge Morgan's expression remained stony. "You have no evidence," he said flatly. "This is your word against an officer of the law." Leah's heart pounded. She knew this was coming. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steadying as she met his gaze, "I've gathered testimonies from others who have experienced similar treatment in this courtroom. These aren't isolated incidents. This is a pattern." Judge Morgan's eyes narrowed. "A pattern?" he scoffed. "Do you think a few disgruntled complaints are enough to challenge this court's authority?" Before Leah could respond, Olivia rose from her seat, clutching a thick folder of documents. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with confidence, "I have here affidavits from over a dozen individuals who have faced similar bias in your courtroom. Each one details instances where they were treated unfairly or dismissed without proper consideration." The room erupted into whispers, and Judge Morgan's gavel came down hard. "Silence," he barked. His face flushed as he gestured toward Olivia. "Who are you to interrupt my court?" "My name is Olivia Carter," she said boldly, refusing to back down. "I'm here as a witness and an advocate for justice." Judge Morgan's glare shifted between Leah and Olivia. "This court does not entertain theatrics," he said sharply. "Miss Carter, if this is the best you can do, you've wasted enough of my time." Leah felt her anger flare. "Your Honor, isn't the purpose of this court to seek the truth? If you dismiss this evidence without review, you're proving my point, that this courtroom isn't a place for justice." The room went still. For a moment, Judge Morgan seemed taken aback by her boldness. Then, with a sneer, he leaned forward. "Watch your tone, Miss Carter. This is my courtroom, and you will show respect." Leah stood her ground. "Respect is earned, Your Honor, and so far, you've shown none to me or the others who've suffered under your rulings." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Judge Morgan's face darkened. "One more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt of court." Just then, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. All heads turned as a woman in a crisp suit entered, flanked by a camera crew. Leah recognized her immediately, a local journalist who had been covering systemic issues in the judicial system. "Your Honor," the journalist said, her voice cutting through the tension, "I'm here to observe these proceedings. The public has a right to know how justice is being served." Judge Morgan's composure slipped further. "This is highly irregular," he sputtered, his voice rising. "Who authorized this?" The journalist didn't flinch. "Public courtrooms are open to scrutiny. Unless you have something to hide?" The tension in the room was palpable. Leah seized the moment. "Your Honor, this is about more than my case. It's about accountability. If the truth is on your side, you have nothing to fear from transparency." The judge's gavel slammed again. "Enough. This court will take a recess." He rose abruptly, his robe billowing as he stormed out of the room. As the doors closed behind him, the courtroom erupted into conversation. Leah's father, Congressman Daniel Carter, approached her, his face filled with pride. "You're doing great, Leah. Keep standing strong." "He's trying to silence me," Leah said, her voice trembling with frustration. "But I won't let him." Olivia placed a reassuring hand on Leah's shoulder. "We've got the journalist here now. The world is watching. He can't dismiss you so easily anymore." When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was electric. Judge Morgan returned his expression tight. "Miss Carter," he said through gritted teeth, You may present your so-called evidence, but be warned. If this is a waste of my time, there will be consequences. Leah stepped forward, her legs shaking but her resolve firm. She handed the folder of affidavits to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. These testimonies show a pattern of bias, she said. Each one is a story of someone who felt unheard and dismissed, just like me. As the judge flipped through the documents, his frown deepened. The courtroom was silent, every eye on him. Finally, he looked up, his expression unreadable. This court will review these claims. But let me remind you, Ms. Carter, that accusations alone do not constitute proof. Leah met his gaze, her voice steady. That's why I'm here, Your Honor. To ensure these accusations are investigated and justice is served. The judge's lips thinned, but he nodded. Very well. The court is adjourned until further notice. As the gavel fell, Leah felt a rush of relief and triumph. It wasn't over, but she had taken the first step toward holding Judge Morgan accountable. As she turned to leave, the journalist approached her. Leah, your courage is inspiring. We're going to make sure your story is heard. Leah smiled, tears welling in her eyes. Thank you. This fight isn't just for me. It's for everyone who deserves a fair chance. Walking out of the courtroom, Leah felt the baby kick again, as if reminding her of the stakes. She placed a protective hand over her belly, her resolve stronger than ever. This was just the beginning of her fight for justice, and she was ready for whatever came next. As Leah stepped out of the courtroom, the brisk air filled her lungs, grounding her after the intense confrontation inside. She clutched her father's arm for support, her mind racing with a mixture of relief and determination. The journalist's presence, coupled with the testimonies Olivia had brought forward, had shifted the courtroom dynamics. For the first time, Leah felt the weight of public scrutiny press against Judge Morgan, and it was a welcome reprieve from the isolation she'd felt in her fight. You were brilliant in there, Olivia said, falling into step beside her. He can't ignore this now. Leah nodded, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. It's a start. But he's still in control, and I don't trust him to play fair. Congressman Daniel Carter, Leah's father, gave her a reassuring smile. Then we take this fight outside the courtroom. The press is on our side now, and the public deserves to know the truth. Over the next week, Leah's story began to spread like wildfire. Local news stations covered her case, highlighting not only her treatment in Judge Morgan's courtroom, but also the broader issues of systemic bias and discrimination in the justice system. Olivia worked tirelessly with the journalist to compile and publish the stories of others who had been mistreated. Each testimony added to the growing pressure on Judge Morgan. One morning, as Leah scrolled through her phone, she came across a headline that made her heart race. Civil rights groups demand investigation into Judge Morgan's conduct. The article detailed how multiple organizations had rallied behind her cause, calling for an independent review of his rulings. Leah's name was now synonymous with the fight for justice, and while the attention was daunting, it was also empowering. But the battle was far from over. Behind the scenes, Leah and her father prepared for the upcoming hearing where Judge Morgan would be forced to respond to the allegations. They worked late into the night with Olivia and the journalist, gathering more evidence and refining their arguments. The hearing day arrived with a flurry of anticipation. The courthouse steps were packed with supporters holding signs that read, "Justice for all" and "End judicial bias." Leah's heart swelled at the sight of the crowd. For the first time, she truly felt the strength of a community united for change. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Judge Morgan sat at the bench, his usual stern demeanor now overshadowed by a flicker of unease. The court clerk announced the proceedings, and Leah took her seat, flanked by her father and Olivia. The hearing began with Leah's lawyer presenting the evidence they had compiled. The affidavits, video testimonies, and statistical analysis of Judge Morgan's rulings painted a damning picture. One by one, witnesses took the stand to share their experiences, their voices steady despite the weight of their words. When it was Leah's turn to testify, she stood tall, her voice clear and unwavering. "I came to this courtroom seeking justice," she said, addressing the panel of judges overseeing the hearing. "Instead, I was met with dismissal and disrespect. But this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who has been silenced and overlooked. We deserve better." As she spoke, she saw heads nodding in the audience. Her words carried the weight of countless stories, and she knew they were making an impact. She glanced at Judge Morgan, who avoided her gaze, his discomfort evident. The panel's questions were pointed and thorough, probing into the evidence and Judge Morgan's history. His lawyer's attempts to dismiss the allegations fell flat against the overwhelming testimony. The hearing stretched into the late afternoon, and by the time it concluded, Leah felt drained but hopeful. That evening, Leah and her team gathered at her father's house to await the panel's decision. The atmosphere was a mix of nervous anticipation and quiet determination. They had done everything they could. Now, it was out of their hands. When the call finally came, Leah held her breath as her father answered. "Yes, this is Congressman Carter," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. He listened intently, then broke into a wide smile. "Thank you. We'll be there tomorrow." "What did they say?" Olivia asked, her eyes wide. "The panel has decided to open a formal investigation into Judge Morgan," he said. "They've also recommended his suspension pending the outcome." The room erupted into cheers, and Leah felt tears stream down her face. It wasn't the end, but it was a victory, a validation of everything they had fought for. The next day, Leah stood on the courthouse steps, addressing the crowd of supporters and reporters who had gathered. "This is a step forward," she said, her voice strong despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "But our work isn't done. We must continue to hold our leaders and institutions accountable. This fight is for justice, equality, and the future of our children." As the crowd cheered, Leah felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in months. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling her baby's movements as if they were cheering too. This was the world she wanted to create for her child, a world where voices mattered and justice prevailed. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into Judge Morgan uncovered a pattern of misconduct and bias. His suspension turned into a resignation, and reforms were implemented to ensure greater accountability in the judicial system. Leah's case became a catalyst for change, inspiring others to come forward and demand better. Though the journey had been arduous, Leah emerged stronger and more determined than ever. She continued to advocate for justice, her story a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless. And as she cradled her newborn months later, she whispered, "We did it, little one. We made a difference." The weeks following Judge Morgan's resignation felt like a whirlwind for Leah. The fight had been exhausting, but as she sat in the quiet of her living room one evening, rocking her newborn daughter in her arms, the weight of her journey settled over her. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could breathe deeply, free of the suffocating oppression she had battled for months. Leah's story had become a symbol of justice, resonating far beyond her local community. She had received letters from people across the country who saw her courage as a beacon of hope. They thanked her for standing up to a broken system, for fighting not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced or dismissed. Some of these letters came from individuals who had long given up on finding justice, and reading their words filled Leah with a profound sense of purpose. Her father, Congressman Daniel Carter, often visited her during those first weeks after the baby's birth. He'd sit by her side, recounting the changes her case had inspired. "Leah, you've done something extraordinary," he said one evening, his voice filled with pride. "The reforms being implemented in our courts are just the beginning. Your fight has sparked something that can't be stopped." But Leah wasn't content to let her victory end with Judge Morgan's resignation. The systemic issues she had uncovered went far deeper than one judge, and she knew there was still work to be done. She joined forces with civil rights organizations, lending her voice and experience to campaigns for judicial reform. With Olivia by her side, she began speaking at events, sharing her story to inspire others to stand up for what was right. At one such event, a young woman approached her, eyes brimming with tears. "Miss Carter," she said, "your story gave me the courage to fight back against my injustice. I've always been afraid to speak out, but seeing what you've done made me believe I could make a difference too." Leah hugged her tightly, feeling a swell of emotion. "You're stronger than you know," she said, "and your voice matters. Never let anyone take that away from you." In those moments, Leah felt the true impact of her fight. It wasn't just about her victory in the courtroom. It was about the ripples of change that were spreading outward, touching lives she would never even meet. It was about empowering others to believe in their worth and to demand the justice they deserved. At home, her daughter became a constant reminder of why she had fought so hard. Late at night, as she held her baby close, she often thought about the world she wanted to create for her. A world where fairness wasn't a privilege but a right, where people weren't judged by the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. "You'll grow up strong and proud," Leah whispered one evening, brushing her daughter's cheek. "And I promise I'll keep fighting to make this world better for you." In time, Leah's case became a pivotal chapter in the larger narrative of judicial reform. Documentaries were made, and her story was studied in law schools as an example of how one person's courage could challenge an entire system. Yet, Leah remained humble, always redirecting the spotlight to the collective effort of her community and the unwavering support of her family and friends. She often reflected on the moments when she had felt like giving up, when the weight of the fight seemed too much to bear. It was in those moments that she had leaned on the people who believed in her: her father's steady guidance, Olivia's fierce determination, and the growing support of the community that had rallied behind her. Together, they had shown her that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change was possible. As the years passed, Leah continued to advocate for justice, her daughter growing up with a mother who had proven that one voice could make a difference. And while the scars of her fight remained, they served as a reminder of her strength and resilience. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast a warm glow across the living room, Leah's daughter, now old enough to understand, climbed into her lap. "Mama, is it true that you stood up to a mean judge?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Leah smiled, wrapping her arms around her daughter. "Yes, sweetheart. I stood up because it was the right thing to do. And you know what? You can always stand up for what's right too. Never forget that." In her daughter's gaze, Leah saw the promise of a brighter future. And as they sat together, the echoes of her fight still resonating in the world around them, she knew that the journey she had begun was far from over. The torch of justice had been passed, and she was ready to see it carried forward, burning brighter with each generation.